Everyone thinks they know this story. A woman, an apple, a snake, paradise lost, the moment everything went wrong. It's one of the most repeated stories in human history. It shaped Western law, Western guilt, Western ideas about what it means to be human, and almost everyone who tells it gets it wrong. Not wrong in the sense of blasphemy, wrong in the sense of having skipped the verses. Wrong in the sense of repeating a Sunday school version that smooths out all the strange, uncomfortable, genuinely bewildering details that are right there in the text. The details nobody taught you, the ones that change everything. Genesis doesn't say apple. It never did. It says fruit. The word apple entered the story through a Latin translation in the 4th century, a pun, actually, between the Latin word for apple, malum, and the Latin word for evil, also malum. Jerome was translating the Hebrew into Latin and made a choice that stuck for over 1,000 years. That's the first strange thing about this story. The most famous fruit in history isn't named. It has no flavor, no color, no size in the original. Just fruit, from a tree whose description matters far more than what it looked like. Jerome's punning translation was never meant to be definitive. It just was for the better part of a millennium. And now billions of people picture an apple that Genesis never described. It's worth sitting with that. The most iconic detail of the most famous origin story in Western civilization is a 4th century translator's wordplay, not scripture. The snake isn't called Satan, not in Genesis, not even close. The word in Hebrew is nachash. It just means serpent. No horns, no pitchfork, no fallen angel. The identification of the snake with the devil comes hundreds of years after Genesis was written. It shows up in later Jewish literature, in the New Testament, in early Christian theology. But in the original text, the serpent is just a creature, a very clever creature. It's described as the most cunning of all the wild animals God made, not a demon, an animal, an animal. An animal that talks, yes, but the text doesn't find that worth explaining. It just begins. No backstory, no introduction, no explanation of how an animal learned to speak. The story doesn't blink. And then there's the thing that surprises people most. Once they actually read it carefully, there are 2 trees. 2 of them. Everyone remembers the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the one they ate from. What most people don't remember is that there was also a tree of life. It's mentioned in chapter 2. It gets almost no attention before the fall. But it becomes enormously important after. We'll get there. Because the 2 trees, together, are the real architecture of this story. One eaten from too soon, one forever out of reach. The whole story pivots on that asymmetry, and almost no popular retelling of this story even mentions that a second tree existed. So before we go any further, if you find this kind of thing remarkable, subscribe. I put these out every day, and I genuinely hate for you to miss one. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I read every single one. Now, let me take you back to before the beginning. Or rather, to the 2 beginnings, because that's another thing almost nobody mentions. Genesis doesn't start the story of Adam and Eve once, it starts it twice, and the 2 versions don't quite match. That fact alone changes how you read everything that follows. Because from the very first page, the text is doing something more complicated than simply telling a single, straightforward story. When scholars sit down with the book of Genesis and read it carefully, line by line, original Hebrew, one of the first things they notice is that chapters 1 and 2 tell 2 different stories, and they don't line up. The first story runs from chapter 1 through the very first verses of chapter 2. It's majestic, it's cosmic. God speaks and things exist. Light on day 1, sky on day 2, land, sea, plants on day 3, sun and moon on day 4, sea creatures and birds on day 5, land animals, and finally, humans on day 6. It's orderly, it's almost mathematical. And crucially, in this version, God creates male and female at the same time. Male and female, he created them. One moment, together, both made in the image of God. There's no priority, no sequence, just the paired creation of humanity as a single act. No rib, no garden scene, just a declaration from the sky. Then you hit chapter 2, verse 4, and the story starts again. This second version is completely different in tone. It's intimate where the first was epic. God doesn't speak things into existence here. God gets his hands dirty. He forms the man from dust. The Hebrew word is Adamah, ground, earth, soil. Adam from Adamah, ground, earth, soil. Adam from Adamah. The man is named for the thing he's made of. It's a deeply material image, not light, not breath, not decree. Dirt shaped by hands. God breathes into his nostrils. It's a close-up, almost tender moment, a breath shared between a creator and what's being creator. Then God plants a garden. Then God makes the animals one by one and brings them to Adam to name. And only then, after Adam can't find a suitable companion among all the creatures, does God create woman. From Adam's rib. The order of creation is completely different between these 2 accounts. In the first, vegetation before humans. In the second, man before vegetation. In the first, animals before humans. In the second, man before animals. In the first, male and female together. In the second, man first, then a long search for a companion, then woman. If you put both accounts side by side and try to harmonize them into one timeline, you can't. The contradiction is structural. Ancient readers knew this too. They argued about it, wrote commentaries on it, and proposed solutions that ranged from creative to desperate. None of them resolved it. The text holds the tension deliberately. Scholars have a name for this. They call the author of the first version the priestly source, the P-source, formal, structured, theological. They call the author of the second version the Yahwist, J in German, which is where the tradition started, intimate, earthy, anthropomorphic. Most critical scholars believe these are two separate authors writing in two different eras, whose texts were later woven together by editors. The editors preserved both versions side by side, even though they contradict each other. I find that extraordinary. Whoever assembled the final text of Genesis made a deliberate choice to keep both stories. They weren't bothered by the inconsistency the way a modern reader might be. Or maybe they thought the tension itself was meaningful, that one story wasn't enough to capture what they were trying to say, that the cosmic version and the intimate version needed to coexist. Either way, we have two creation accounts, two atoms, two moments, and the story we're here to talk about today lives entirely in the second one, the J source, the intimate one, the one where God walks in the garden and calls out like a parent looking for a child. Let's talk about the garden itself. Because Genesis is unusually specific about it, and that specificity is strange. The text says God planted a garden in Eden in the east. Eden in Hebrew comes from a root that means abundance or delight. Some scholars connect it to a Sumerian word for plain or steppe. The garden is in Eden, it's not Eden itself. That's a subtle distinction the text actually makes, though it tends to get lost in shorthand. Eden is the region. The garden is a place within it. A specific, bounded, cultivated space set inside a wider world that already exists. Which means, incidentally, that there was a world outside the garden from the beginning. Eden didn't encompass everything. Now, 4 rivers flow out of the garden. Genesis names them Pishon, Gihon, Hiddekel, which is the Tigris, and Pereth, the Euphrates. The Tigris and Euphrates are real rivers. They still exist. They run through modern Iraq, through the heart of what used to be ancient Mesopotamia. The other two, Pishon and Gihon, are harder to identify. Various proposals have been made over the centuries. The Nile, the Indus, rivers that have since dried up or shifted course. Nobody agrees. But the geographical specificity is notable. This garden is being placed somewhere real, or at least somewhere the author believed was real. It's not floating in myth space. It has coordinates. And those coordinates point to the same region that gave us the earliest known cities, writing, agriculture, and law codes. The cradle of civilization, and, according to Genesis, the location of humanity's beginning. Whether that's literal geography or a literary choice to anchor the myth in the known world, the effect is the same. This isn't set in an abstract nowhere. It's set in the most historically significant region on Earth. Inside the garden, God plants every kind of tree that's pleasant to the sight and good for food. And then Genesis names 2 in particular, 2 trees, right there in verse 9 of chapter 2, the tree of life, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We hear endlessly about the second tree, the forbidden one, the one they eat from. The first one, the tree of life, barely gets mentioned before the fall. But here's what I want you to hold on to. God never forbids Adam from eating the tree of life. The prohibition is only against the tree of knowledge. The tree of life is apparently available. Adam and Eve presumably could have eaten from it at any time. They just didn't, or hadn't yet. That detail will become critical later. It's arguably the hinge of the entire story. Here's the part that gets me. Some contemporary scholars have argued that the description of Eden maps onto the architecture at ancient temples. In ancient Near Eastern temples, the holiest space was guarded, elevated, and associated with divine presence. Rivers flowed from the sanctuary in religious imagery, water from sacred space spreading outward into the world. There were sacred trees in temple precincts. God dwells in the garden the way a deity dwells in a temple. And at the end of the story, God places cherubim with a flaming sword to guard the entrance. Temple guardians. Stone guardians flanking ancient Near Eastern temple gates were called lamassu, winged bulls, sometimes lions, sometimes human-headed. The cherubim with the flaming sword are doing exactly what those guardians do. If the garden is a temple, then what happened when Adam and Eve were expelled isn't just exile from paradise, it's exile from the presence of God. From the sacred space where humans and the divine coexisted. That's a different kind of loss, not just comfort, but contact, not just abundance, but proximity. Chapter 3 opens with one of the most consequential sentences in the Hebrew Bible. Now the serpent was more cunning than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. That's it. That's the introduction. Not the serpent was the devil. Not a fallen angel took the form of a snake. The serpent is a wild animal, one of God's creations, the most cunning of them. One line, no backstory, and then it speaks. The Hebrew word translated as cunning is aram. It appears throughout the Old Testament, sometimes meaning prudent or shrewd, sometimes with a negative connotation of craftiness or trickery. But here's the thing that biblical scholars find genuinely remarkable. The word arams, cunning, is almost identical to the word arams, naked. They're from different roots, but they sound almost the same. And those two words appear in consecutive verses. Chapter 2 ends, and the man and his wife were both naked, aram, and weren't ashamed. Chapter 3 begins, now the serpent was cunning, aram more than any other wild animal. That's deliberate wordplay. The author put it there intentionally. Nakedness and cunning are linked from the opening breath of this chapter. The naked humans will encounter the cunning serpent. By the end of the chapter, they'll cover their nakedness and be driven out. It's the kind of literary architecture that gets lost in translation, but is unmistakable in the Hebrew. A door swings on a single sound. The whole chapter is set up by a two-word pun across a chapter break. In English, you'd have to be told. In Hebrew, any reader would feel it immediately. The words ring against each other like two notes struck in sequence. Now, when did the serpent become Satan? This is worth knowing. The identification doesn't appear in Genesis at all. The first clear connections emerge in later Jewish apocalyptic literature, texts from roughly the 2nd century BCE, like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees. The Wisdom of Solomon, written in the 1st century BCE or CE, says, "Through the devil's envy death entered the worlds," one of the earliest explicit identifications. The New Testament's Book of Revelation calls Satan that ancient serpent, connecting the dots explicitly. But that's written in the late 1st century CE, almost 1,000 years after Genesis. For the original audience of Genesis, the serpent was a serpent, crafty, troublemaking, but an animal. The cosmic drama of Satan as a fallen angel rebelling against God is a later theological layer, a story told on top of a story. Read Genesis on its own terms, and the serpent is simply the cleverest creature in the garden. That's all it needs to be for the story to work. The question isn't where it came from. The question is what it says. And what it says turns out to be largely accurate, which makes it one of the most unsettling antagonists in any ancient text. A troublemaker who tells the truth is harder to dismiss than one who simply lies. There's one more thing about the serpent worth noting. God's punishment of it is, you will crawl on your belly and eat dust all the days of your life, which implies the serpent wasn't crawling on its belly before. Did it have legs? The text doesn't say, but the punishment assumes a before and after. Whatever the serpent was before this moment, it was different. Some ancient readers found in this a clue. Early Jewish commentary imagined the serpent as upright, almost human in appearance, a creature that could look you in the eye. That's not in Genesis. But the gap is there, and people have always tried to fill it. Some gaps are too interesting to leave alone. Here's a detail I think is one of the most quietly extraordinary in the entire story. When the serpent asks Eve about the forbidden tree, Eve recites the rule. And her version is slightly different from what God actually said. God's original command to Adam back in chapter 2, verse 17, "You shall not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die." Eve's version, in chapter 3, when the serpent asks, God said, "You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die." She added, "Neither shall you touch it." God never said that. The prohibition was only about eating. Eve added touching, one extra clause, and that clause isn't in any version of the original command. Notice also what she changed at the other end. God said, "You shall surely die." Eve says only, "lest you die." She softened the consequence too. Whether she meant to or not, her version of the rule is both stricter on one end and vaguer on the other. The adding and the softening together paint a portrait of someone who has heard a rule secondhand and is doing her best to reconstruct it under pressure. Now, there are a few ways to read this. 1. Eve is being extra cautious, building a fence around the law, a practice common in Jewish legal tradition, where you add extra prohibitions to prevent accidentally violating the core one. Don't even touch it, so you're not tempted to eat it. 2. Adam told her the rule wrong, or told her a stricter version. We don't know. The text doesn't show us Adam explaining the rule to Eve. She was created after the prohibition was given. Someone had to have told her. 3. The serpent's question rattled her, and she misremembered or embellished in the moment. The stress of being questioned changed what she said. Any of these could be true. The text leaves it completely open. But the effect of the discrepancy is real. It means Eve is operating on a slightly inaccurate version of the original prohibition. And the serpent, cunning, remember, exploits exactly that gap. When Eve says, "You shall not touch it, lest you die," the serpent's response can be read as, "See? You're already not sure of the rule. You won't surely die, it says. God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. The serpent's claim is technically true, by the way. God confirms it later. After they eat, God says, "Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil." The serpent didn't lie about what would happen. It lied about the consequence, "You won't surely die." Or, and this is what's ambiguous, it didn't lie, because they don't immediately die. Adam lives for 930 years in the genealogies. Whether you shall surely die means immediate death or mortal existence is something theologians have argued about for centuries. The serpent may have found a loophole in the wording, but it all started with the telephone game, a rule passed between people that arrived slightly wrong. One added clause, one softened threat. And the most cunning creature in the garden was paying close attention to exactly that gap. The first information asymmetry in the Bible, and it started with a misquote. Information passed through a chain of two people, and by the time the serpent asked Eve to recite the rule had already changed. That's all it needed. So they eat the fruit, and the text says, "Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked." Before we get to the nakedness, let's slow down at knowledge of good and evil. Because that phrase is doing a lot of work, and it means something more specific, and stranger, in Hebrew than it sounds in English. In Hebrew rhetoric, there's a device called a merism. A merism is when you express totality by naming two extremes, day and nights, meaning all the time, heaven and earth, meaning everything that exists. Good and evil in this sense isn't a moral binary. It's a merism for everything, all knowledge, all awareness, all experience. Adam and Eve didn't just learn the difference between right and wrong, they gained awareness of the full spectrum of existence. Every shadow, every pleasure, every grief, the whole range of what it means to be conscious in a world that includes both beauty and suffering. The serpent didn't promise wisdom in a narrow sense, it promised everything. Some scholars read knowledge of good and evil as awareness of moral categories, the capacity for ethical reasoning that distinguishes humans from animals. Before the fall, they were innocent. After, they're morally conscious, responsible, capable of shame and guilt. That's one reading. Other scholars read it as sexual knowledge, the awakening to sexuality and reproduction. The support for this, the first thing they notice after eating is their nakedness. They make loincloths. The serpent's promise that they'd be like God could be read as gaining the capacity to create life. Several ancient traditions interpreted the fall as fundamentally a sexual awakening, the moment humanity discovered it could participate in generation. Other scholars, particularly those reading the ancient Near Eastern context, note that knowing good and evil is used elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible to describe wisdom, discernment, mature judgment. It's used to describe what a king should have, what distinguishes an adult from a child. In that reading, Adam and Eve went from childlike innocence to adult awareness. They grew up, suddenly and irreversibly. The garden was a kind of protected ignorance. The fruit ended it. The text supports all three readings and resolves none of them, which is either a flaw or a feature, depending on how you look at it. I'd argue it's a feature, because the story is trying to describe something so fundamental to human experience that no single frame is sufficient. The ambiguity isn't an accident of translation or a gap in the author's thinking, it's load-bearing. The story needs to hold all three readings at once to do what it's trying to do. What's clear is what they do immediately. They knew they were naked. The Hebrew word is the same family as the arams from earlier, that wordplay again, threading through the chapter. And they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. That's the first human act after gaining knowledge of everything. Not building shelter, not making weapons, not worshipping, not philosophizing. They covered themselves, they felt exposed, they made clothes. I find that deeply, specifically human. The first response to awareness isn't power, it's vulnerability. Shame, or something adjacent to shame. A sudden consciousness of being seen, of being exposed not just physically but fundamentally. The knowledge that changed them first expressed itself as a wish to hide, to cover the thing that now felt wrong about simply existing. Fig leaves were the nearest material, hastily grabbed, stitched together into something that barely counted as clothing. The knowledge of everything, and the first application of it was modest needlework in a panic. And then, they heard footsteps. Chapter 3, verse 8. And they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. Stop there. Just stop with that image for a moment. The God of Genesis chapter 1 spoke, and galaxies erupted into existence, separated the waters from the waters, set the sun in the sky. That God is now walking in a garden in the afternoon breeze, like someone taking a stroll before dinner. This is the J source in full, the intimate author, the one who writes God as close to human as the text ever gets. The Hebrew phrase for cool of the days is l'rach hayom, literally, in the wind of the day. The afternoon when a breeze picks up. God walking in the garden breeze. It's one of the most vivid, almost domestic images in all of religious literature. Nothing trembles, no fire descends, just footsteps and wind in the leaves. An ordinary afternoon, except it isn't, not after what they've done. And the text implies this walk wasn't unusual. God walked in the garden, regularly. This was a thing that happened. The J-source assumes a pre-fall relationship where proximity between God and humans was simply normal, not miraculous, not exceptional, just the daily rhythm of life in the garden. The fall doesn't just end innocence, it ends that ordinary closeness. And then God calls out, "Where are you?" Now, this is a question that has generated an enormous amount of commentary. An omniscient God asking, "Where are you?" Either God genuinely doesn't know, which contradicts later theology, or the question is rhetorical, pedagogical. God is asking not because God doesn't know the answer, but because God wants them to answer, to speak, to be found not physically but in some other sense, to account for themselves. In traditional Jewish commentary, the Midrash, this question is read as an invitation to self-examination, not a factual inquiry. Where are you? Not where are your feet, where are you in relation to what you've done? It's an opening, not a search. Adam answers from behind the trees. I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid myself. God's response is almost a parent's response. Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree of which I commanded you not to eat? And here's the first full sentence Adam speaks as a morally conscious being. After gaining knowledge of everything, after the serpent's promise, after the fruit, Adam's first real statement is, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit of the tree, and I ate." He blames Eve, and in the same breath, subtly, he implicates God. "The woman whom you gave to be with me, you gave me this woman." This is the woman's fault, and also, if we're being honest, yours. It's astonishing. The text doesn't editorialize. It doesn't say Adam was wrong or cowardly. It just records what he said. And what he said was, not me, her, you. The first morally conscious human act, after the fig leaves, is deflection. Complete and immediate. Knowledge of good and evil, and the first use of it is to reassign responsibility. There's something almost comic about it, and also something deeply recognizable. Awareness of moral categories arrived, and the immediate application was not confession but evasion. That pattern hasn't changed much. Eve, when questioned, does the same thing to the serpent. The serpent deceived me, and I ate. Down the chain it goes. God asks, man blames woman, woman blames serpent. The serpent has no one to blame, so it gets the curse first and hardest. Now come the punishments, and here's what I want you to notice about them. They're weirdly specific. Each one explains something that was already true for the audience reading Genesis. They aren't abstract moral consequences. They're grounded in the everyday hardships of ancient agricultural life, hardships the first readers lived inside. The serpent's punishment first. Cursed are you above all livestock and above all beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life, crawling on its belly, which implies, again, that it didn't before. Whatever the serpent was, upright, legged, the punishment changed it. It's now the animal we recognize. The story accounts for every snake that has ever unsettled anyone. And then I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. This verse, Genesis 30:15, is one of the most theologically loaded in the entire Bible. Christians from early on read it as a prophecy. The offspring of the woman who crushes the serpent's head is Christ. This reading is called the Proto-Evangelium, the first gospel. Jewish tradition doesn't read it that way. Scholars who try to stay close to the text read it as explaining the eternal enmity between humans and snakes. Why do people jump when they see a snake? This story. Why do snakes bite at human feet? This story. It's an etiology, a story that explains the origin of something already known. Then the punishment for the woman. I will greatly multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. And then, your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. 2 parts, painful childbirth, and subordination to the husband. Scholars note that these read as explanations for conditions the ancient Israelite audience experienced as simply the way things are. Why is childbirth so painful for humans compared to other animals? Why do women live in societies where men have authority over them? Genesis offers an answer. It wasn't always this way. It's a consequence of the fall, a punishment, not a design. For Adam, cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you. Farming is hard. Why is farming so hard? Why is the ground resistant, full of weeds, demanding constant labor? This story, the ground is cursed. It used to be different. The ease of the garden, where God planted and tended and everything simply grew, is gone, and in its place is the rock and the thorn and the sweat. The Neolithic Revolution, with all its back-breaking labor, compressed into a single curse. Archaeologists have found evidence that the transition from hunter-gatherer life to farming actually coincided with a measurable decline in human health. Shorter stature, more disease, harder physical wear. The ground really did become harder to live from. Genesis intuited something true. And the closing note of Adam's punishment, "You are dust, and to dust you shall return," mortality, made explicit for the first time. "In the day you eat of it you shall surely die," was the original warning. The actual death comes here as a named certainty. You came from the ground, you'll go back to it. The Adama claims the Adam in the end. These punishments form what scholars call an etiological myth, a story that explains the present state of things by narrating their origin. Snakes slither, childbirth hurts. Farming is labor, humans die. Why? Because of this. The garden before the fall is a mirror image of all these realities, a world without them. A world that explains the world we have by describing the world we lost. Here's the verse that stops me every time I read this chapter. After the pronouncements, after the punishments, after all of it. Before God drives them from the garden, Genesis 32:1, and the Lord God made for Adam and for his wife garments of skins and clothed them. God makes them clothes. Think about that. They sewed themselves fig leaves, a frantic, improvised covering, the first thing they could reach in a moment of sudden, overwhelming self-consciousness. God replaces those with something better. Garments of skins, animal hides, properly made, durable, warm, made with care, not in panic. There's a craftsmanship implied here that their leaf stitching couldn't match. The Hebrew word for the garments, kutunit, is the same word used elsewhere for the priestly robes worn in the tabernacle and later in the Jerusalem temple. Scholars have noted that. I don't know what to do with it entirely, but I notice it. God clothing the expelled humans in the same word used for priestly vestments, as if even in the act of casting them out, something consecrated passes between them. In the middle of the expulsion story, the God who is punishing them stops to make sure they'll be warm. This small detail, and it is a small detail, easy to skip, has been noticed by readers across traditions. There's something in it that doesn't fit the frame of pure punishment. The God of this story is angry or disappointed or whatever the appropriate word is, but is also, apparently, a maker of clothes for frightened, newly mortal humans. It's an act that sits oddly inside the story's tone, and I think that's exactly why it's there. Not comfort, not forgiveness. Something harder to name. Care offered alongside consequence. Now the garments of skins imply an animal was killed. Genesis doesn't say which animal or how. This is the first death in the narrative, if it is a death. The text doesn't say God killed an animal. It says garments of skins. But skins come from somewhere. Some early Christian readers saw this as the first sacrifice. Animal death to cover human sin. That's a reading, it's not in the text. But the gap is there, and the gap has been doing theological work for 2,000 years. And then, immediately after clothing them, God says something that's often treated as alarming. Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Now, lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. And the sentence breaks off. The text doesn't finish the thought. Lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. And then the action is just, therefore the Lord God sent him out from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. God drives them out, in part, because of the tree of life. The one they could have eaten from the whole time but didn't. If they eat from it now, after gaining knowledge of everything, they'll be immortal and knowing. And that, the text suggests, is too much. The garden must be sealed. Remember, 2 trees. They ate from the wrong one first. The tree of life was always there, always unguarded, always available. Nobody forbade it. Nobody warned them away from it. It just stood there, unnamed in the conversation with the serpent, unreached during their time in the garden. And now, precisely because they've gained what the second tree offered, the first tree must be locked away. Knowledge without immortality. That's the deal. That's what they leave with. The final act of the story is the expulsion, and it happens fast. Therefore the Lord God sent him out from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. 2 images here that deserve more attention than they usually get. First, cherubim. In popular imagination, cherubim are chubby-winged babies. Renaissance painting did that to them. In the Hebrew Bible, they're nothing like that. They're powerful, composite creatures. In Ezekiel's vision, a cherub has 4 faces: human, lion, ox, eagle, and 4 wings. In the Psalms, God rides on a cherub. In the tabernacle and later the temple in Jerusalem, golden cherubim flanked the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies, the innermost, most sacred space. Cherubim mark the presence of the divine. They guard sacred thresholds. They don't comfort, they block. You don't walk past a cherub. In ancient Mesopotamia, the cultural world where Genesis was assembled, Temple gates were guarded by lamassu, giant stone figures, winged bulls, or lions with human heads. They stood at the entrance to palaces and temples. They kept the impure out. They marked the boundary between ordinary space and holy space. If you've seen photographs of the Assyrian lamassu in the British Museum, 12 feet tall, stone, impassive, you have some sense of what Eden's Gate guardians might have looked like in the imagination of the text's first readers. The same cultural logic, different names. The cherubim placed at Eden's Gate are doing the same job, guarding the threshold between the divine space and the human world. If Eden is a temple, and some scholars argue strongly that it is, then the expulsion is exile from the sanctuary. Adam and Eve aren't just losing a garden. They're losing the place where God lived, where they could walk with God in the afternoon breeze. Second, the flaming sword that turned every way. The Hebrew here is unusual. It's sometimes translated as a flaming turning sword or a sword of flame that revolves. It's a unique phrase in the Bible. There's nothing quite like it elsewhere. Whatever it is, it's both sword and fire, and it moves. It's not just a lock on a gate, it's a dynamic, living barrier, something that can't be rushed, tricked, outlasted, or waited out. The return is permanently foreclosed, and with that, the gate closes. The story of the garden ends. Adam and Eve are outside, they'll survive, they'll have children, life continues. But the garden is sealed behind them, guarded by creatures of fire and power, and the tree of life is beyond reach. Now there's one more thing, because the story doesn't actually end at the expulsion. A few verses later, in chapter 4, Cain grows up and something happens that raises a question the text never answers. After he kills his brother, Cain is exiled, sent to the land of Nod, east of Eden. And there, Cain knew his wife, and she conceived. He also builds a city, with other people apparently already in it. If Adam and Eve were the first humans, who are these people? Where did they come from? The text is completely silent, not a word of explanation. It just keeps going. As if there were always more people, just off-screen, in the world beyond the garden. The story has edges it doesn't explain. It always did. So what is this story? It's not a cautionary tale about disobedience, or if it is, it's a strange one. Because the serpent told the truth. Because God confirmed the outcome. Because the text never says the fruit was poison or the knowledge was bad, it just says you were told not to, and you did anyway. The story doesn't editorialize about whether the choice was wrong. It records what happened and lets the punishment speak. The reader is left to decide what it means. It's not a story about the origin of evil, not exactly. The serpent is never called evil, it's called cunning. Cleverness caused this. Curiosity. A desire to know. The will to reach for something just beyond what was permitted. Whether that impulse is the problem, or the most human thing in the story, the text refuses to say. The serpent wanted something, so did Eve. The wanting itself isn't condemned, it's not a story with a clear villain. The serpent had motives the text doesn't explain. God had reasons for the prohibition the text doesn't fully explain. Eve reached for the fruit. The text says she saw it was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise. That's not greed. That's hunger, beauty, and the desire for wisdom. All three. You'd be hard-pressed to call those bad instincts. And yet here we are outside the garden, working the ground, dying. What it is, what I think it is, reading it carefully, in its own terms, is one of the oldest attempts to explain the human condition. The gap between what we are and what we might have been. Why consciousness carries weight. Why we know we're going to die and have to live anyway. Why we feel exposed, watched, responsible for things we didn't fully understand when we chose them. Why knowledge and loss arrive together, as a package. The story doesn't answer those questions. It just holds them, in a form old enough that almost everyone on Earth has heard some version of it. That durability is itself remarkable. Thousands of years of retelling, translating, arguing, reinterpreting, and the story is still here, still generating commentary, still unsettled. A story that resolves neatly doesn't need to be told this many times. The story doesn't resolve. Adam and Eve survived the expulsion. God closed them, that detail again, small and strange and kind, sitting right in the middle of their punishment. There are more humans, apparently, in the world beyond the garden. Life continues. The tree of life is behind them, guarded. The tree of knowledge is metabolized. It's in them now, part of them, changed everything. Every child born from them carries it too. That knowledge is the inheritance. Not the garden, not the ease, not the afternoons walking with God in the wind of the day. The knowing. And somewhere to the east of where they started, a gate stands, guarded by fire. Behind it, a garden. Behind the garden, a tree no one will ever reach again. That's where the story ends. With a gate. Not quite a conclusion. If you want to know what happens next, Cain and Abel are up next, and that story is even stranger than this one. 2 brothers, an offering, a murder, a wandering, and a mark that no one has ever agreed on what it means. That's episode 3. If you're new here and you missed the beginning, episode 1 is the creation story. 2 accounts of how everything started, the cosmic and the intimate, and all the things Genesis says that most people have never heard. It's linked in the description. If you made it to the end of this one, you're exactly who this channel is for. I'll see you in the archives.